So far, you have tried to include environmental preoccupations into the general mega trends of labor law, the typical instruments of labor law. Is that also true the opposite? Can we also translate labor law instruments into the political economy of energy, into the main institutions of energy, or not?
I definitely think so. And one of the most important example is the principle of just transition, that it's now regulated in recent environmental and climate law policies. So recent decarbonization policies overall have embraced the idea of justice in the transition away from fossil fuels. We should bear in mind that those policies are policies within a different field of regulation and policy, which is environmental law or climate law and the other related branches. But they have embraced concerns of the occupational impacts of decarbonization policies and the role of workers and their representatives in mitigating the effects of decarbonization policies on labor market. So that's, a very important example. Then we could discuss whether or not the idea of just transition is really a convincing one, if there could be alternatives. There is a big question about who shapes the idea of justice in the transition to a low carbon economy on the one hand, and despite the rhetoric on the role of social partners and collective bargaining, unfortunately, these actors do not have real power, real voice in the transition away from fossil fuels. And the other critique that we could move to the concept of just transition is that so far in new industrial policies, it is very much focused on the procedural dimension of the transition towards a climate neutrality or away from fossil fuels, while there is no much debate on the outcomes of the transition. And this is a problem because the outcomes of the transition to a low carbon economy are not neutral in terms of labor power and labor sustainability. So workers should really have a voice in defining not only the instruments to, let's say, mitigate or reduce the negative externalities of decarbonization on the labor market with, training activities, labor market policies in general. Here there are some interesting theoretical frameworks like transitionary labor markets, which is very relevant for this specific angle of analysis. But beyond that, there is much more to do about the construction of the kind of economy that current and future generations of workers deserve in terms of institutions, for example, in terms of energy models that will fuel the market economy of tomorrow, or even alternative forms of organizing economic activities at local level that could be very interesting to explore also in a labor law perspective.
I have a last question which builds on what you just said, and because from an historical perspective, it seems that you're claiming that in at the very origin of labor law in a coal and mine setting, you had a strong power for the collective actors, which was reflected into then political institutions and labor law instruments, which was somehow lost during the petrol era. And now it seems it could come back during the renewable energies era. The question is that a matter of proximity to the interests that are interconnected with the energy that we produce, or is that other reasons why you think that the renewable era is particularly promising from a labor law institutions perspective?
Yeah, first of all, I think that natural resources and energy is created using natural resources are a commons. So as long as they are a commons, they should be treated as a common good. So they cannot be used for profit reasons. So this is one important claim that we should move from when analyzing the impact on the energy transition, also on social institutions and democratic structures as a whole. In order to treat energy sources and natural resources in general as a commons, we should create institutions. And within these institutions, workers should have a voice as stakeholders, but also as shareholders, because in the perspective, for example, of renewables, workers and local communities could be both producers and users of energy. So that's a point. You mentioned the coal era, the coal age, the miners. At that age, I mean, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, workers and their representatives, especially in the most extractive countries, have really a power of voice and control over the energy model, over the energy instruction and distribution. And they use this power to democratize not only the mining industry, but the overall economic system. They use the power to call strikes in the energy industry to achieve goals also in other sectors through solidarity strikes and some forms of coordination across industries. This kind of power in the energy market, which was reflected in power of workers in the labor market, as you said, was lost with the advent of petrocapitalism, because the political economy of oil and gas as well, and partially of the nuclear power, is a completely different one. It's a dispersed one. It's a hierarchical one. These are capital-intensive industries where workers have actually no voice at all, or the possibility of redistribution are so high that there is no room for social conflict within those industries. And even where there is social conflict, for example, in the oil value chain, if you interrupt the flow of energy in a part, the network, which is a globalized one, is able to find other alternatives. No? So workers with petrocapitalism really lost the power to control the energy industry and the energy sector, and the power of energy that could be used for democratic purposes or for strategic, economic, geopolitical purposes, as we are experiencing today with the war in Ukraine. So, I mean, the idea is that we could have a synthesis with the transitions away from fossil fuels in a renewable energy kind of world, where communities could regain the power of controlling the energy market to achieve social goals. I'm not sure that this could be specific roles for workers, labor law, and the representation of workers through trade unions and classical industrial relations institutions, but some forms of renewable energy models, and mainly the community-based energy models, actually demonstrate that by democratizing again the power of energy could have an impact, a positive impact on the democratization of society as a whole. And of course, this is a dimension that is local. So proximity is a very important aspect when it comes to finding a way in which energy could serve actually societal purposes and is not treated as a good for profits, basically. So, I mean, there are good experiences, good cases of local communities engaging also workers in forms of cooperatives or other kind of more cooperative institutions at local level that are also able to change the political economy of the territories in which they operate. And that is, I think, a very important development that we should analyze more in depth, and looking at the possibility that it opens also for the re-democratization of work. But if you think, for example, today with the current energy crisis, it's pretty clear that pressures on energy costs have also an impact in terms of wages, not least because of energy-driven inflation that is eroding the buying power of workers, while in a system where workers are part of communities that can produce energy autonomously, there will be a reduced impact of energy inflation over the buying power of wages on the one hand. But on the other side, as long as we imagine a system which is community-based, where communities, citizens and workers, but also consumers, can join in forces to use the power of energy to democratize the overall economy, I think it's a model, a development that could achieve not only environmental and energy justice, but also social justice. Because with this power, exactly like the miners used to do in the 19th and 20th century industrial era, through this power, you could steer the market economy towards social and environmental justice. You could relocate activity, manufacturing activity at a local level. You can monitor that these activities are sustainable, both in terms of labor and environmental impact, etc. It's probably still utopian to look at these forms of evolution of the market economy, but we should resist the idea that energy strongholds will take over the energy transition, because we have many cases in which renewables are also managed by traditional energy strongholds, therefore reproducing all the hierarchies and negative effects that we have experienced with petrocapitalism for 50 years now. Of course, there are also contradictions. One of these is the fact that to fuel the decarbonization of industrial capitalism, we need lots of energy resources, raw materials extracted mainly in the most vulnerable countries. So we should avoid the risk of underestimating the invisibility of modern technology, because for many time we have underestimated the invisibility of classical technology. We thought that energy was something created and was something present in nature, but energy was created through coal and then through oil and gas or nuclear power. So the same goes for renewables, but where you need, I mean, of course, we could use the energy of sun and other natural resources that are renewable, actually. But then we need technology to make these resources work. And besides technology, there are still raw materials and natural resources that should be extracted. And we should monitor that this extraction process is not made at the expenses of people, and especially the most vulnerable people, often from the global south. So as labor lawyers, I think, what can we learn from this dimension of the energy transition is that we should articulate labor law in a life cycle perspective that considers not only employment relationship in a given visible industry, but that also looks at upstream and downstream processes and of the energy and beyond energy value chains. So I think that we should consider also how today, for example, what we produce in visible industry have an impact in terms of waste. The waste disposal industry, it's a very important one, which is underexplored in labor law literature and also in industrial relations literature. But that's a problem, because we could argue and we can work to support the struggles of workers to achieve subordination within classical industrial companies, which have now turned to robotics, artificial intelligence, technology. But we can't afford to forget that beyond that, the life cycle of the products that these workers produce could be very unsustainable in both social and environmental terms. So we should look at these aspects as well, both downstream and upstream, the overall global supply chains of everything we do.
Thanks very much. It has been an illuminating set of, it's really food for thought for us. So thanks very much, Paolo, for your intervention, and we hope to see you back here very soon. Thank you.